Hello, Rebels. Welcome to the base. It's Thanksgiving week, which is very exciting for me. It's my first Thanksgiving as an American citizen, so I've always loved this holiday. I particularly love it this year. Kristen, are you a Thanksgiving fan?
I am, now that I am no longer a liberal.
What's that got to do with it?
When I was at Berkeley, I used to protest against Thanksgiving, and I tortured my entire family by not allowing anyone to give thanks. It was a terrible holiday. It was horrible. Okay. I know. I was insufferable for a little period of time there. So you learn that it's not about that. It really is about just taking a moment to give thanks. And I really am thankful that this is your first Thanksgiving as an American citizen. That's huge. That's really amazing.
I thought it really is an amazing holiday. I love it. There's nothing like this in England. And the thing I always love about it is that it really is a celebration of the things that really matter: family and friends and food, keeping it all going. And there's no gifts and whatever. I think it's wonderful. I really love it. And I mean it when I say it's my favorite holiday. I'm so excited to be celebrating it with family. But that means that we're not here taping for you a new episode of the podcast because we're doing Thanksgiving. And so we're going to have something from the vault you may have missed from a couple of months ago. We hope you enjoy it. And then we hope you'll come and join us for a new episode straight after the holidays when Kristen and I will be back.
That's exactly right. We're going to have a bunch of new episodes. And so don't forget to catch up, number one, on episodes you missed. And two, make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's Apple, Spotify, or you can watch us on YouTube. Happy
Thanksgiving, everyone.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Kristen Garcia-Dumont is with me, and we're also joined today by Benji Backer, a friend of mine who I've spoken to a number of times on my Fox News show. He is the founder of a really, really interesting organization, and I think it could be very, very relevant to the movement to bring about change here in California, because what he's trying to do is show how people on the right, conservatives, Republicans, can engage in the environmental argument in a positive and constructive way. And I think that is a big, big thing that we certainly care about on this show. Lots of people up and down the state do. Benji, just a quick introduction to yourself and your organization, if you would.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's great to be with you. And Kristen, I'm Benji Backer, president and founder of the American Conservation Coalition. I live in Seattle, Washington, so we're dealing with a lot of the same issues up here as your friends to the north. And grew up in Wisconsin. My sister lives in Oakland, and I love hiking and skiing. I think that's all you need to know about me.
They're very good. Okay, well, let's get straight into some of these issues, because I think that one of the things that has contributed to this feeling amongst a lot of people in California who would be open to considering Republican candidates, to Republican politicians, and just thinking of themselves as potentially supporters of parties or candidates on the right. One of the big barriers to that, I believe, is this notion that the Republican Party has gone completely kind of crazy on the environmental issue. And some of this is caricature by political opponents. Some of it may be valid, but there is a kind of sense out there that the Republican Party is just the party of denial when it comes to climate change and a total lack of interest in environmental policy. And to me, that's always sat at odds with what I know to be true about many people who are conservatives. I mean, the clue is in the name, who really care about, who understand nature, who love nature, the countryside, and want to protect it. And they're very pro-environment, as it were. But it's just, it doesn't quite fit with the narrative of what being pro-environment means these days, which is to be, all in favor of the crazy Green New Deal.
It's exactly right. I mean, we've lost the narrative as conservatives, and that's hurt us completely in the polls, because it makes people, especially in my generation, think that the only party that can solve environmental issues is the Democrats, and that it's really Green New Deal or bust. And that's a big problem. I mean, you look at California, right? And a state like California, the most beautiful parts of the state are conservative areas. They're red, more rural areas. And that's where conservatives vote. They care about the environment because there's an incentive to care about it because it's their own backyard, right? It's like, it's their farm, it's their ranch, it's their forest land. And yet we've lost the narrative completely. We've completely given it up to the left to dominate it through their proposals, which largely have nothing to do with the environment and are focused on economic takeover and overhaul. And instead of coming up with our own solutions, we've just decided to either run the other way or stay silent. And it's really hurting us in many ways.
Kristen, what's your take on all this?
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I'm so excited to have you on, Benji, because, you know, I have teenage boys, and one of the things that actually has been a challenge to get them to understand is exactly that narrative or that dichotomy that you suggest, which is that it's Democrats who care about the environment and conservatives who do not, which is actually stunning for us because Steve knows this, but you don't. You know, we have a lot of friends who are farmers. So these are people whose actual lives and livelihoods depend on being very attuned to what's going on in the soil and water in California and wildfires. And so I grew up just assuming that conservatives were the environmental party. And so to be educated by my kids that, you know, we're sort of considered the old heads who don't get it. And, you know, we don't care about the environment has really been tragic because it's just a PR sort of messaging issue on the one hand. And then two, I don't think enough conservatives actually talk about it. Like, we think there are sort of bigger fights to be had. But when we're talking about how do we put things right with California, you know, one of the big issues facing all of us is drought and wildfires. That goes right to environment. And this is a perfect opportunity for us to be talking about it and showing that we have informed opinions and we have great policy ideas. So excited about you.
So Benji, let's dive into one of the points you made there, which was you mentioned as you were sort of laying out your case that a lot of the Democratic Party, or let's just call it the left, because it's not just the party, the left's arguments on the environment actually aren't pro-environment. They are economic in some sense. Just explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, well, first I want to address Kristen's point, which is so amazing. And I think
you can't do that. You have to address my point.
It's like the presidential debate. So it's like,
no, you do exactly.
Although I'm not trying to avoid it. I just want to emphasize what Chris was saying,
of course,
which is basically like my generation, which I'm guessing your sons are younger individuals who care a lot about these issues.
Yep.
This generation prioritizes the environment as a number one or number two issue almost every time. And yet they have this stereotype that is so blatantly false. So I completely agree. And a lot of my peers are the same way. And I was the same way. I thought I was a conservative on everything but the environment. That's what I would explain to people. I'm a conservative, but not on the environment. Why is it not conservative to care about the environment? I started to ask myself. So it's totally resonating. Steve, you look at the policies that they are proposing, like the Green New Deal, which is the most drastic. I mean, I don't want to say that all Democrats support that because a lot of them don't. But the Green New Deal is the most drastic policy they have. And even their chief of staff, or the chief of staff to AOC, said that this bill or this package or whatever, that's not even a real policy, this resolution is a economic overhaul, not a climate policy. And yet everyone thinks of it as the alternative on climate change. So even that, just as an example, is why this issue being co-opted by the left is so damaging for not only conservatives, but the environment itself, right? Like, I care a lot about the environment. I just like you two do. And, you know, to see a party that is constantly dominating the conversation, also not actually putting policies forth that put the environment first, is very, very frustrating. And one other example in California, wildfires, right? And I know we're going to hopefully talk about that at some point. But if the policy was to manage forests in a way that is substantive and strategic and forest fire preventative, we wouldn't have these large scale fires every year. We have an opportunity to mitigate some of the damage, and we've just allowed it to go unfettered because we blame everything on climate change when climate change makes things worse. But forest fires are happening regardless because we are mismanaging our forests. And yet the policies that are being proposed are really nothing from the left on forests. So there's just countless examples like that.
Yeah, exactly. They take the forest fires, the wildfires, when they happen, and sadly, this summer is going. We can assume that there'll be more, just as last year and into the fall here in California. And instead of taking that and saying, right, here's what we need to do about wildfires, they say, see, it proves we're right about climate change, and that's why we need the Green New Deal. That's literally the way that argument goes. But on wildfires, one of the points that's that we hear a lot on this show and elsewhere is, well, actually, the reason that we haven't had the kind of pragmatic, substantive forest management, fuel reduction that you're talking about is precisely environmental objections, environmentalists like the Sierra Club standing in the way of that. What's going on there? You're in the middle of all this conversation, all these people. Why would an environmentalist not want sensible forest management?
Well, let me just say this. I believe climate change is a real threat, but I think that Sierra Club does more damage to our climate than climate deniers do, because they put forward policies that are actually worse for the environment and worse for climate change. And forest fires are a perfect example of that. Being anti-nuclear is another example of that. Sierra Club is a joke, and they're disguising themselves as an environmental organization, and they reap so many benefits from it. They are seen as kind of this legacy environmental organization because they used to do incredible work. They used to work across the aisle. They used to be the head of the environmental movement. But now they've seen, wow, if we can use political power to force the will of people to stand for things in an alarming way, to make them feel scared and fearful of their lives, we can get more money and more members and more political power. And that's exactly what's happened. They are disguising themselves as an environmental organization, but they're really a far left political organization that is seeing the benefits of being incredibly divisive and alarmist. And that's why they're against forest management, which is anti-science. That's why they're anti-nuclear, which is also anti-science. The science is not on their side when they pretend that it is.
Well, Steve, one of the things that's interesting about your question is we assume that everybody's who's on the environmental side, right, we're going to say for now that that's the left, has these pure motives, when actually I think they've been proven over time that they don't. That, as Benji's saying, this really is about power, as it so often is. And so it's a very easy, politically expedient sort of tagline to say, I believe in climate change, I'm for the planet. Republicans sort of hate the earth, they don't care, they're climate deniers. Sort of young people vote for us. But one of the things I want to ask you, Benji, is one of the frustrations I have with, I'm going to put the younger generation as, I don't know, you decide the line, maybe 25 and below, is
all right, I'm in that.
They don't do anything.
Like
I'm so excited to talk to you because you're actually doing something about it. So I hear a lot of rhetoric, right? I believe in the environment, but they're actually not doing something, that actually effectuates change. And I'm talking about something from very small to like, hey kids, let's go and clean up the beach, right? That's like pulling teeth, to let's try and focus on what actually is going wrong in California, right? So we're born and raised in California. California is a desert. Okay, most people forget this, right? And so we get the majority of our water from the north and from California, and we go through periods of drought. I've been dealing with it for a long time. And so now it's getting a lot of attention. It always does during periods of drought and wildfire. And we get caught in this legislative gridlock. All the politicians fight, everybody's pointing fingers. And then the rainy season hits and everybody forgets that we had a climate problem.
Yeah, like 2019. That's exactly right. And the reservoirs were full.
And round we go. And nothing changes. And to sort of keep people focused on, you've got to actually take an action this week, today, something to help improve the environment and then continue fighting has been really tough. So people like to talk about the environment, but I don't know if you found this. I've just found that people actually don't keep going down the path of effectuating change.
Yeah, we live in a culture where almost everyone seems to have like an attention disorder. Like it's crazy how unwilling we are to focus on something because we can get something done so quickly, right? Like we can quickly text somebody about something, or we can look something up, or we can post something on our Instagram story about how we're concerned about an issue and then think that that's good enough. And I run an environmental organization called the American Conservation Coalition that's trying to build a youth movement that's focused on action instead of rhetoric. But I can't tell you how hard it is to get young people to go out and clean up that beach, to go out and do that trail management, to go out and contact their legislator, to do things that aren't actually that hard and don't take that much time, but that they claim to be passionate about. And that's like, they are passionate about it. But I think there's this sense that if something doesn't happen right away, like if you can't be able to do it in 30 seconds or less, then it's too much work. And I think young people are willing to work hard, but they want like the instant gratification. And with an issue like the environment, these are big problems. There's no instant gratification. You can't just like have a 115-degree heat wave in Portland, Oregon, and then go back down to 75 degrees because someone changed something overnight. Like, that's not how this stuff works. And so I think that's the problem, is that young people do care about these issues. They want to make a difference on them, but they feel like taking that action is too cumbersome. And that's something we've got to change.
So what would you were very aggressive against the Sierra Club. I was surprised by that, because they are this sort of hallowed institution, particularly here. Let's get really specific. What would your kind of manifesto, your plan look like, contrasting with what they want to see happen?
I think there are
specific policy areas. Yeah. So
four specific angles that I think are super important. The first is energy innovation. We need way more innovation and technology if we're going to fight environmental issues, because we don't have the technology yet to make nuclear economical. We don't have the technology yet to have wind and solar energy be stored in storage facilities so that it actually can be scaled. We don't have all the innovation and technology. That's got to be the first priority. And, it's not going to be regulation that solves climate change. It's going to be innovation. And I'm not just talking about climate change either. I'm talking about all environmental issues. The second, sorry, go ahead.
No, you do your list, and I want to come back to each of them. I'm just making notes. Go on.
So second would be natural solutions. What I mean by that is restoring wetlands, restoring natural areas, planting trees, managing our forests, those sort of things that are related to our natural world. The third is the idea that we need to completely focus on nuclear energy as a main energy source to fight climate change. Obviously, innovation on all energy sectors is important, but without nuclear, we can't solve environmental issues or solve pollution or climate change. And the fourth is making these solutions global. We need to hold China and India accountable. And the best way to do that with their environmental damage is to make all of our solutions here scalable everywhere else across the globe. If we're just regulating something here, they're not going to do that in China or India. We need to do things here in the United States that work for us, but also work for others. And usually that's making it more economical. So it's a market-based perspective. It's technological growth. It's not, and it's leaning on local communities and people who know things in their areas the best, rather than some sort of one-size-fits-all solution. It's not as sexy. It's not as easy to explain, but that's what it's going to take.
So let's look at the first of those, innovation. I mean, Chris and I, we're in Silicon Valley. We know the tech community very well. I mean, the venture capital industry, in my encounters with them, they're really interested in, low or zero carbon technology. They as investors, just as human beings, they tend to be people, in my experience, who are very engaged in the environmental issue, do take climate change seriously. They think it's, and they agree with what you're saying, and they look for those kinds of investments. So what else needs to happen? So you could say, well, yeah, that's you're right. Innovation is going to be a key to this, but like, what would you do that isn't already being done?
Well, first of all, there's a huge problem in the fact that a company like Amazon is looking to put $1 billion each year into climate, and they don't even know where to put it. Like, they have no idea even what to do with it. So all these companies want to do something with it, but there aren't even enough young entrepreneurs working on this across the country. I think most people my generation who want to do something about it should try to start their own business, should get involved in the entrepreneurial side of this. And I think that that's a generational thing. There's some really good ideas out there, but young people are not flocking to those sorts of jobs. They're going to the Amazons and the Microsofts and stuff like that. And I mean, my peers are going to those companies, which is great, but there are a lot of opportunities in the private sector that I still don't think are being pursued as much. And then on top of that, I wish states like California and Washington, where I live, and DC, and our elected officials in those places would focus less on, oh, what sort of mandate are we going to impose on society, and more, how can we make these technologies more market competitive? Instead of investing in ruining people's lives, let's invest in making people's lives better by scaling technology that makes us competitive with China and reduces emissions. I don't think we're doing enough of that either. And I'm not just talking about DC, I'm talking about California and Washington and all these states as well.
I think that's right. We have the news focuses on no plastic straws.
Right.
Like the amount of energy we spend on something, I'm saying that in the euphemistic sense, on those kinds of campaigns rather than, something that actually really matters is pretty stunning.
Right. And there's just not enough support in the private sector or the federal government or the state governments for the marketplace reforms that are needed, for the technological reforms that are needed. And we're wasting time talking about plastic straws instead.
Yeah. And I have to say the lawyers get in the way too. The amount of regulation and the amount of litigation over all these issues. Because I do know actually a fair amount of entrepreneurs who are trying to get, have these very novel ideas in Silicon Valley about energy conservation and sort of how to build something that's scalable. It gets very daunting when they bump into all of the regulations, sort of this wall of, you don't know what you're talking about. Yep. There's hundreds of very complicated, laws that all interlink that you're going to violate. And they're very quickly pushed back on their feet. And investors, I think, get a little bit nervous because when you're immediately taking on litigation as a new company, nobody really wants to get involved in that or invest in that. So we also need to look on the sort of the lawyer and legislation side and figure out what are we doing wrong that's actually not enabling a lot of this technology from being developed, because we do want to protect these, quote, hallowed institutions, to use Steve's point. And those hallowed institutions, I think, have gotten a little corrupt.
Yes.
And benefit from the sort of legacy system that we have now.
But I'm just trying to understand that from a government point of view. Maybe I too often come at this from the perspective of, okay, what do you want the government to do? If we had a magic wand, what would you at the state level or the federal level? I mean, what would you do? I mean, when you say, are we talking about directing taxpayer money in some form or other towards certain kinds of investments? Because that hasn't, I mean, well, that's a whole contested area, isn't it? Because some people say that's been a disaster, and they point to things like, well, the one, I wasn't here for that, but Solyndra is always held up, as an example of that. Yeah. You put government money into something, and the government's terrible at picking market winners, and more often than not puts money to losers. So that's one argument. The other argument is, oh, well, actually, if you look at Silicon Valley, for example, and a lot of technological progress, it's hugely been dependent on government money. Look at Google. That the only reason we have Google is because of the Department of Defense and whatever. So
Tesla.
What's the Tesla origin?
Well, Tesla gets so many tax credits.
The tax credit, exactly. Yes, yeah. The requirements. Yes, but the subsidy as well for the consumer.
Exactly.
In other words, which side of that are you on, Benji? I mean, is it like the government? I mean, do you want to see more active government intervention to kind of, I don't know, what's the word, to nurture these new technologies? I'm just trying to understand what you would have the government do.
Yeah. So one of the really interesting things that you just brought up is kind of like this. What is the relationship between the government and these technologies that has or hasn't worked? The reality is almost everything successful in this country started out as subsidized by the federal government, especially in the environmental space. The oil and gas sector, it was incredibly subsidized. And so it's a very...
And still is, according to the critics. Is that fair?
They have...
I see that the whole time. Why don't we stop? This is a classic talk about, let's stop subsidizing the oil and gas industry, put that subsidy into green technology. Here all the time.
I mean the research and they get a lot more research and development dollars today than they do subsidies for just developing energy. Before, they were like getting tax credits for producing energy. Now it's more they're getting financial support when they're coming up with new technologies and new innovation in their own space with research and development. But my point in saying that is it makes it very difficult to say, well, what's equal, right? Like, how much should you give solar and wind if you've given this much to oil and gas, which is what the solar and wind people say. And then you have the oil and gas people saying, oh, well, solar and wind shouldn't be subsidized, even though their own industry is. So it creates a lot of confusion. But to answer your question, I think really the big problem that people have when we're talking about climate change is that no one really truly knows what is necessary to solve a challenge like climate change. And no one knows exactly what a specific policy or a specific regulation change or incentive is going to do in terms of lowering pollution and lowering greenhouse gases. Like, I get asked all the time, how much would X, Y, or Z bill reduce emissions? No one knows. And we're just hoping that it does the right thing. And I think at some point someone has to come up with some sort of mechanism to start having at least a mechanism to have an understanding of what that could look like. But until then, which is something that I'm advocating for and involved with, until then, I think we need to invest financial federal, state, and local dollars into American-made technology that we know is going to have a very positive impact. Nuclear, we know that. Carbon capture, we know that. It's going to have a huge positive impact. We know that we need battery storage because solar and wind economically is going places. We know that batteries are being used for electric cars, and that electric cars are going, kind of off the charts right now in terms of growth. So there's some things that we know that we need to do to catch up with the rest of the world. And I do think that we need to be investing as much research and development as we can into coming up with new innovation there. And on top of that, I also, instead of just subsidies, which I'm not as big of a fan of unless it's super early in research and development, I do like the idea of, in different parts of the economy, providing tax credits for technological development, for reducing emissions if you're able to track that as a company or as a state. Like, I think that there should be some sort of incentive to reducing the environmental impact rather than just totally blatantly subsidizing something that might not work. I would rather reward the result.
Yeah. Okay, let's get to that. Because one of the mechanisms that is presented as a kind of politically unifying approach to this does exactly that, which is the notion of a carbon price, or carbon tax, as it's often described. Whereas basically, the government is neutral about what individual companies or places do, but there's a sort of blanket tax on carbon across the economy, which leaves it up to the market to most efficiently hit the goals. And I've seen, I think that's the one that George Shultz, when he was alive, he was a big advocate of. Is that right?
Yep.
Obviously, former, absolutely legendary Republican Party figure. What do you think? But I also hear people saying that's an outrageous idea, and we can't have a carbon tax or a carbon price. What do you think about that idea?
So it's a really good question, and I have previously been in favor of it. In Washington State, there was a revenue neutral carbon tax. Basically, the tax from the carbon price would go back to the consumers after it was collected. Of course, that's assuming that you trust the government to do that. But
yeah, that was the proposal that Schultz and co. were pushing as well, which was they called it, I don't know what they called it, like a
carbon fee and dividend.
Say that again. I spoke over
carbon fee and dividend.
Right. There you go.
Yeah. So I think economically and on a white paper, it looks really good, but that in practice, I'm not sure it would work. And as someone who has been in favor of it previously, I think that there are some severe concerns. And there are three kind of main concerns I have. The first is it raises the price of energy, because if you tax carbon on energy producers, they're most likely going to increase their prices, which hurts the lower class the most. On top of that, the big companies, the big oil companies, are in favor of it because they can afford to pay the carbon tax, whereas the smaller companies can't, and so they go out of business under most of the proposed models. And then on top of those two issues that I think are existing, I still think that it really severely puts America at a disadvantage because it raises the price of producing energy in the United States, where we do it a lot cleaner and a lot better than other places across the globe, and it starts offshoring some of our pollution, which we do enough of already, to other countries because it's going to be cheaper to produce energy there. So I have some skepticism on it. And on top of that, to your point, it's not very politically feasible right now.
Well, that's a very compelling case. I feel the same way. I've been attracted by it at certain points. Yeah, that makes sense. Give the money back, let the market decide, put the tax on, and the companies can respond in different ways. But your objections there are very persuasive. Kristen, what do you think?
Well, I actually wanted to take a step back and figure out, so what is American Conservation Coalition? Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
What do you guys do?
So we believe that the right of center space needs its own environmental movement, and a movement based on right of center conservative values. Because we feel like those are the best values to solve environmental challenges, and because we deserve to put our voice at the table. So we are young conservatives who want to fight environmental issues, and we've been creating chapters across the country. We have thousands of members in hundreds of communities, and it's been really fun to build what I think, structurally is like a right of center Sierra Club. Obviously, we're taking a stance on policy approaches a lot differently than they are, and we're not gluing ourselves to Nancy Pelosi's door to try to make a point, which they do. But we definitely are trying to build that same thing, because if you care about the environment or you care about conservative politics, you realize that we need our own environmental movement, and that's what we're creating.
Okay, and so there is a policy aspect to it, right?
Yeah, so we actually passed the first climate bill of all time, or of this current Congress, passed the Senate last week, 92-8. It was a bill that we were very much involved with and very much supportive of, and it incentivizes farmers. It provides a tax credit for them to reduce emissions on their property in an industry where farming is really struggling. Farmers are really struggling, and there's also over a third of emissions comes from natural, like farming, agriculture type emissions. So huge bill, 92-8 it passed. And you have these people protesting in the streets about inaction when they're not doing anything to get policies passed. And we are very much involved in the policy conversation, getting these bills and policies passed. And they're not like the one size fits all solutions, but they do make progress.
That's amazing. That's the farmers. It's a tax credit for farmers.
Tax credit for farmers if they are able to show that they're reducing emissions on their property, and it's really amazing how this
very smart.
Right.
Has it passed the House? What's happening with the House?
The House is expected to vote on it in the next couple of months because the government doesn't make any sense, and that's what it's going to take.
Okay.
Well, that's great, because it's providing a sort of an economic incentive. So to your question, Steve, it's like that, we just need to come up with more market solutions rather than.
Yeah, but that's a great example.
I was just going to say, and this is a perfect example of, it sounds like people coming together, having a pretty, good understanding of what the issue is, but using market incentives to get people to do the right thing. Those are the ones that do the best, right? Incent people, don't force people.
Well, and give people the power. Give people the power, right? Like give the instead of punishing farmers, give them the choice to have an economic benefit from doing the right thing environmentally.
Yeah, it's actually the exact opposite of the carbon tax, isn't it? It's like rather than
punitive.
Yeah, exactly. It's rather than higher taxes. It's actually cutting taxes if you do. They're interesting,
right? Which is similar to what we did for developing tech. It's like we're going to give you actually a tax credit because we want these investments in R&D. And so it sounds like it's something similar, which is we want you to be investing in lowering your emissions. And a benefit of that is that you're going to get this tax credit. So it's nice when we use something from one sector that works and moves it over. And it sounds practical, because so many environmental policies are impractical.
Right.
And so you lose a lot of people when you're saying, Steve and I've talked about this, right? Like, diverting the water for a certain species of fish. Like, okay, I understand why the environmentalists wanted that one thing to happen, but to pay no attention to the consequence, literally, not just figuratively, downstream from those diversion tactics, is really what mars, I think, environmentalism and people wanting to be part of environmentalism.
Let's talk about I want to get to some of the other items on your list, because you've got such a broad view of this, and that's what I think is one of the strengths. You're not just obsessed with the one narrow aspect of this, as so many of the other campaigners are used to. The second item was you talk about natural solutions, planting trees, ecosystems, whatever. Is that conservation, like protecting wilderness land and so on, or is it creating new natural habitats, or is it both?
So it's better managing our current federal and state lands. I mean, if you look at our U.S. Forest Service, it's so undermanaged, and local people aren't able to help take care of it. There's just this bureaucracy there. And I'm not advocating for those lands to be sold to companies or the private sector, but there should be the ability to buy, for local people to buy into the solutions to manage those forests, to manage those lands. The West is incredibly owned, largely owned by the federal
it's
government.
Amazing, isn't it?
And it's so mismanaged. It's so mismanaged, and that's why we have a lot of these wildfires. State public lands are usually better managed in terms of the revenue and also just the natural management. So it's a little bit of better management with local buy-in and planting more trees, restoring wetlands that have been destroyed. And you're seeing sportsmen and women, hunting and fishing people from across the country work on these initiatives, not because of climate change, but because they want to have, a conserved area for them to go hunting and fishing. It's amazing how much of an impact that can have on reducing emissions for people who either care about climate change or not. And it's like going back to second grade when we learned that trees sequestered carbon. It's amazing what we can do when we plant trees.
But the driver for this isn't climate change. It's just conservation as an end in itself, right?
Why not both?
I know, but that's right. But the reason I put it like that is it seems to me that one of the reasons that the whole argument about the environment has become so politicized and polarized is because it's just become all about climate.
That's true.
This obsessive focus on carbon dioxide, reducing carbon footprint, carbon, and actually it leaves out the kind of romance of just loving nature and protecting and wildlife and all that kind of stuff, which is actually I wrote about this in my book More Human. It was the chapter about the environment it was actually called Nature, and kids love nature. Everyone loves nature. I mean, who doesn't love it? And so it feels to me like that's a much more unifying thing than just going on and on and on about climate and carbon.
It also allows people to buy into something in their own backyards, because we all have a natural solution in our own backyard, right? Like I grew up near the Great Lakes in Wisconsin, and there's some serious work that needs to be done to restore them and make them less polluted. That's something in your own backyard. If you're in California, forest fires or oceans or, agriculture, these are all natural solutions that you can go and do something about in your own backyard, totally irregardless of climate change. And it allows you to have a personal buy-in, which is my favorite part of that.
It's interesting, Kristen, you don't really, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't think of a Republican leader, let's just use that very broad, who talks like this right now. Certainly in California. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger, you can argue one way or the other. I mean, he's certainly taken a leadership position on climate change and all of that. But what we've just been talking about with Benji, the kind of conservation, the unifying love of nature kind of thing. I just don't hear that from the politicians.
I don't either. And I think part of the reason is this. It wasn't until I went to Berkeley that I heard people talking about like hiking. I'd never been to Lake Tahoe. Like it's a very kind of luxury thing to go hiking, right? So it's like I grew up in San Jose. It's a concrete jungle, rough neighborhoods. You don't go somewhere to just go look at a tree. Like, so you've got people who are just kind of, getting on the bus, trying to get to work, trying to feed their families and so on. So, why people don't talk about it, I think people are really trying to solve what they consider are the everyday problem. And we really need to, I think, imbue in children this sense of wonder of nature. And that means exposing them to some of these things. So we don't spend time talking about parks and public spaces. And those are so important in neighborhoods as well. Otherwise, you don't grow up with any sort of, you have no idea what people are talking about when they're talking about a waterfall. I know that sounds silly, but I never saw a waterfall. Like I don't know what anybody's talking about.
It can come off very elitist.
It's just, I was like, why would I care about a waterfall? I've never even seen one. Like, what does that matter? So you really have to expose children to these, these natural spaces, or they won't care.
You say that like it's exactly right. So it's just such a classic example. Like I never when I was a kid, I didn't do anything like we do with our kids now. Like every weekend we're up in the going, as you say, hiking, whatever. We try to sort of pretend it's not hike. We say we're going on an adventure, and the kids are like, it's a hike. You got the hiking book out. It's a hike, and they sort of pretend they hate it, and then of course the minute that we're out there, they love it because it is actually fun. But we never did anything like that. It was the concrete kind of thing that you described back in England where I grew up. And yeah, I can see that it can come off as a bit elitist, but it doesn't have to be.
Right. It doesn't. It shouldn't be. It really is just, again, going back to sort of messaging and what's important. But I think we have to remember sometimes that people are not appreciating it or paying attention to it just because there's no exposure to it whatsoever. So, again, Benji, sort of back to you of the fact that you're bringing a voice and a young voice to something that's so important and creating an organization where people can get passionate about this and actually do something. And when we can leverage social, and you say people need to kind of they have short attention spans. Well, great. Like, put it out on social media. Let's celebritize, contributing to the environment. And I think, to some degree that can help.
Well, yeah. The reality is people are so disconnected from their environment if they are not in a point of privilege. And if they're super immersed in the climate change movement, they think of the environment as this big global issue that's it's so challenging that they are so stressed and anxious about it, and they don't think they can do anything about it. I would say let's put the environment back into environmentalism. Let's bring everyone into the conversation.
Great sentence.
And let's connect people with their local parks, with their local streams. It might be the most beautiful place on earth, or it might just be a really quaint place in their local neighborhood. Like, let's do that, because that's what we're fighting for. We're not fighting for some sort of Green New Deal. We're fighting for the green beauty that's outside our windows. Let's fight for that.
I love it. I love it. I want to leave it there. That was such a lovely thought, and you're completely right. We're going to talk to you a lot more, I think, Benji, because I think this is just incredibly important for the future in so many different ways. But I love that thought that you had just there. We only got halfway down your list. That's okay. We've got many other opportunities.
It's almost like when I talk about the thing I'm passionate about, I might say a few too many words.
It was no. It was absolutely wonderful. I absolutely love it. And I think that what is so fantastic is that you're showing practical ways of doing it, as Kristen noted as well. You're actually making it happen in a practical way. That is fantastic. Well, all right. When you come back, we'll do the other things. I've got a note here. We want to talk about nuclear power and about how we need solutions. That's a big topic. We talk about that often. It's so important. I'd love to hear your take on that another time. And also the global point that you can't just export, do lovely things here in America and kind of save carbon or whatever, and then have everyone else in the world continuing on a path that's destructive. Really smart points. I want to hear about that another time. But thank you, Benji. That was great.
Well, absolutely a pleasure. And thanks for the work you guys are doing. I mean, I know there's a lot of issues you're focused on. And so covering the environment is very, very appreciated. And I hope to come back because I really had a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us, and come back soon for the next California Rebel Base.